welcome to this webinar session on the discussion that we are having as part of international experience sharing. This webinar today, it focuses on the experience of East Timor. We have our guest speaker, Charles Scheiner, from our partner organization in East Timor, Hamutuk, who is here, has just joined. We have a distinguished, really, panel today. It's going to be a 2-hour discussion. We have formal introductions, then the keynote address by our guest speaker, after which our discussants will have the opportunity to comment on the presentation that will be given by our guest speaker, and then we will open up the discussion, taking the questions from the chat box. So I would encourage everyone to pilot their questions in the chat box, and we'll get back to them when we are in the section of questions and answer and debate. So without further ado, but before that, I would like to give some brief introductory information. This discussion is being simultaneously held in English and Portuguese because of our international participants, but we have simultaneous translation to English. So feel free to speak either English or Portuguese because it's going to be translated. This discussion is being transmitted here via Zoom, but also live streamed in our Facebook and in our CDD youth TV channel. There is also a possibility of, and apart from that, it is of course being live tweeted in our main CDD Facebook. So without further ado, I will invite Honorable Dr. António Boene, the President of the Parliamentary Committee for Constitutional Affairs, Legality and Human Rights, to give formal opening remarks of today's session. Over to you, Dr. Boene.
Muito boa tarde a todos os participantes. Queria, em primeiro lugar, agradecer ao CDD e também ao Fórum de Monitoria do Orçamento pelo facto de estarem a organizar esta série de eventos, webinar, sobre matéria importantíssima para o nosso país, dada a situação em que nós vivemos. E é importante, naturalmente, tentarmos escolher experiências de países que já trataram destas matérias, e diga-se até de passagem, alguns deles trataram muito bem, e como se diz, a roda já foi inventada. O que nós temos que fazer agora é ir buscar realidades que possam naturalmente se adaptar à nossa vida cá em Moçambique, e daí naturalmente tirar experiências valiosas e importantes para o nosso país. Isso significa circunstâncias excepcionais no mercado global de energia e combustíveis, criadas pelas adversidades geopolíticas e socioeconómicas, estruturais e conjunturais, no início do ano, com destaque para a queda do preço das commodities, principalmente o petróleo bruto, a energia e o gás natural, no mercado internacional no início do ano, e pioradas pela eclosão e propagação da pandemia da Covid-19, levaram ao adiamento, a nível mundial, de diversos projetos de investimento no setor de hidrocarbonetos, tendo o Qatar, o maior produtor mundial de gás natural liquefeito, LNG, adiado um grande plano de expansão em que o grupo ExxonMobil, que também opera em Moçambique, é um dos principais parceiros. Felizmente, o setor extrativo moçambicano não se tem ressentido muito das situações adversas anteriormente descritas. Um dos maiores exemplos da resiliência do setor extrativo nacional em relação ao duplo impacto negativo da queda do preço das commodities no mercado internacional, o efeito da Covid-19, foi a recente confirmação de que o maior projeto de LNG de Moçambique, o custo total de investimento está orçado em 23 milhões de dólares. E um dos mais importantes em África, será uma realidade. Há perspectivas do Estado moçambicano poder arrecadar cerca de 50 mil milhões de dólares durante os próximos 25 anos de vigência do contrato de exploração do gás natural, tendo, portanto, potencial de mudar a economia de Moçambique. Isto reforça as possibilidades do país continuar para se tornar um dos 10 principais fornecedores mundiais de LNG. Contudo, para que a abundância de recursos naturais, neste caso específico o LNG, se transforme em riqueza para os moçambicanos, é preciso diversificar a economia, através do uso de receitas extraordinárias para financiar outros setores da economia, com destaque para a agricultura, a indústria extrativa e turismo. E desta forma evitar que Moçambique se torne uma economia altamente dependente da estrutura da indústria extrativa, seria a economia rentista, e, consequentemente, vulnerável aos choques de preços no mercado global de energia. Acredita-se que os FS em países abundantes em recursos naturais possam ajudar a suavizar as despesas do governo e dissociá-las da volatilidade de curto prazo das receitas obtidas com a exploração desses mesmos recursos, evitando assim a doença holandesa ou a maldição de recursos. É neste âmbito que se enquadram os fundos soberanos de riqueza, sobre os quais nos iremos debruçar nesta terceira sessão da série internacional do webinar organizado pelo Centro para a Democracia e Desenvolvimento, CDD, em parceria com o Fórum para a Monitoria do Orçamento, FMO, e a Plataforma Nacional sobre Recursos Naturais e Indústria Extrativa, PII, na qual iremos conhecer um pouco da experiência do Timor-Leste neste processo, através da apresentação que será feita pelo coordenador de programas, pelo gestor, neste caso é o senhor Charles Scheiner, que será o principal orador, e também aproveitar dar atualmente um grande abraço a todos os participantes, palestrantes, oradores e também participantes neste webinar, convencido naturalmente que no final de mais esta sessão sairemos mais informados, melhor informados também sobre realidades que acontecem em outros países e que podem muito bem ser úteis para o nosso país na eventualidade de nós também optar-se por esta solução. E muito obrigado.
Muitíssimo obrigado, senhor Presidente António Boene, por essas palavras de enquadramento. Como bem disse, se trata de uma discussão numa série internacional de busca de experiências para que a sociedade civil possa compreender como é que os outros países pares avançaram neste domínio e como é que depois se pode enquadrar a participação da sociedade civil neste processo da feitura do Fundo Soberano. Muito obrigado pela parceria, muito obrigado pela liderança, fundamentalmente, da Assembleia da República em torno deste assunto, porque, em última instância, caberá à Assembleia da República, como representante do povo, e, em particular, à comissão que Vossa Excelência dirige para estruturar e legislar sobre esta matéria. Por isso, os nossos renovados agradecimentos por continuamente estarmos juntos. Convido agora a doutora Rotafina Dongo. Rotafina Dongo é a diretora da Oxfam em Moçambique. Ela foi convidada pelo CDD, pelo FMO e pela APM, para nos brindar com um keynote address. A Oxfam teve, desde o primeiro momento, na linha da frente na discussão da governação do setor extrativo em Moçambique. E pensamos que, neste keynote address, não só vai ajudar a colocar o framework para a discussão sobre esta problemática em particular, mas também vai utilizar o conhecimento acumulado pela sua intervenção para nos ajudar num quadro maior sobre a governação do setor extrativo e como isso se pode ligar com o desenvolvimento e o alívio à pobreza da nossa população. Sem mais demora, doutora Otafina Dom, é consigo.
Ok, muito obrigada, doutora Adriano. First of all, let me, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Oxfam, greet everyone and equally acknowledge the effort that the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, has been making on behalf of Mozambicans in general and civil society in particular. CDD is a young organization and characterized by the strength and enthusiasm with which it addresses burning issues in our economic, social, and political life. And as a governing body of the Budget Monitoring Forum in Mozambique, I would like to commend the excellent work that CDD has been doing. The webinar series to discuss and reflect on the Sovereign Fund is in fact an opportunity to visit other realities and learn from the countries that have followed this path in the past. There are researches which show that creation and adoption of sovereign funds by government is a measure that aims to safeguard the future of countries in times of crisis and above all to leverage the economy of countries when the exploitation of resources is no longer able to generate desirable and expected revenues. And a very good example is Norway. We'll be talking about the case of East Timor today. We know about Angola. We also know about Nigeria in Africa. So before I delve much in our topic today or our conversation, I would like briefly to introduce Oxfam, which is an international organization whose mission is to tackle the root causes of poverty and creating lasting solutions. As Dr. Adriano has said, Oxfam continues working with several civil society organizations, especially here in Mozambique and other countries, and supporting the organizational and capacity development, as well as the advocacy of various issues and demands that are a priority within a country. Now, going back to our topic at hand, the need to create a sovereign wealth fund cannot be disassociated from the revenues from gas exploration in Mozambique. I'm talking about Mozambique because I'm from Mozambique. And we know in Mozambique as a country is characterized by extreme poverty, low performance in the Human Development Index, high levels of corruption, increasing and progressive closure of the civic space, hidden debts, a very high public debt, and finally, unfortunately, a military conflict that undermines the exploitation of resources that could allow the takeoff of our country in the north of Mozambique, among other aspects no less important. So before we advance with the topic of Sovereign Wealth Fund, I would like to create a cornerstone or a scenario of our conversations today by reminding all of us of the famous resource curse theory, or the so-called Dutch disease, that has been deliberated at length by economists. Let me first start by reminding us of the key fundamentals of this theory. This theory underlies that it is an apparent causal relationship between the increase in the economic development of a specific sector, and in most cases, when we talk about sectors, it's the extractive industry, and a decline in other sectors, for example, and I can cite some, manufacturing and agriculture. And this explains why countries that are richer in natural resources are poorer, have less economic growth, and less democratic processes due to two issues. And the first one is reliance of one product, exposing a country to price changes in that resource. And a very recent example is our COVID-19 case, where we saw that, oil prices going even to the negative levels, that was a history in the making. And the second issue is, despite the narrative about jobs, not so many jobs are created in selling natural resources because they tend to be owned by whomever happens to find the resources first. The reason, they are linked to high inequality and concentration of power. This is also the reason that countries with a lot of resources tend to be authoritarian. But on the other hand, a new generation of economists, they just tell us, okay, hold on, this resource cost theory is sort of like spelling doom. So they are starting to prove that the resource cost theory is not as strong as I have described it. It's just describing doom. And they say that so long as two issues or two factors are concentrated on and they are put in place, then we are okay. And the factor or the first issue is about strong institutions. And first thing that I would like to highlight, we cannot disassociate when we talk about institutions and strong institutions, we cannot disassociate this with the famous rules of the game, which guide economic and political interactions, determine how goods and services are delivered, shape how budgets are spent, and regulate the justice system. So you can see this is a complex thing that the rules of the game guide. But by themselves, these rules are not effective where they are not enacted and effected by effected and trusted institutions. Ineffective institutions lead to wasted resources, undelivered services, and people remain poor because they do not receive the required protection that they need to develop. Strong institutions are therefore imperative for a country's economic growth because they are capable of addressing issues to do with human resource development, corruption, civic space, and understand the importance of involving all citizens in the shaping of a healthy socio-political environment. So that is one factor that has to be fulfilled for us to sort of like take advantage of our resources. And the second factor or issue is of the level of how much investment countries are controlled for. And this goes back to what I said, how much jobs are not created because the resources are controlled by whomever finds them first. So this goes back to the types of contracts we negotiate. If we negotiate bad contracts, then the country ends up with nothing. We end up having resources that are being exploited by others and will only be beneficial after 100 years, which to us, this is not okay. So all this is important as we think of sovereign wealth. Definitely, these two factors are important. So in Mozambique, the funds from exploitation of liquefied natural gas and the sovereign wealth can mean much more than a reserve for the national treasury. They can catapult our diversification of the economy and invest in key sectors of the economy to generate income and jobs. It is imperative, therefore, that important stakeholders, such as the civil society organizations, are involved in the process. They are involved to shape the sovereign wealth that we are supposed to be creating. And for the case of East Timor, a brother country of Mozambique, as well as a member of Palop community with a history of overcoming civil war, and which has already created its sovereign wealth fund, the experiences will be enriching as the country already experiences the reality of the funds arising from the oil exploration and the application of these revenues and funds in socially needy areas. It is encouraging to see that today we have a vibrant and increasingly active civil society in the struggle for greater participation, inclusion, social justice, and transparency in the discussion on issues of public interest. We welcome this initiative, encourage everyone to engage in these fruitful and constructive deliberations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Rota Quinadong, Oxfam Director, for those very enlightening and constructive words you said, and I repeat that institutions matter. They matter for good governance, they matter for growth, a growth which is inclusive, and it tackles the need and it alleviate people's poverty. So in your view, the issue of stakeholder, broader stakeholder engagement, civil society participation, and other stakeholders to be allowed to meaningfully participate, that is key for a process that would lead into a sovereign wealth fund, which is an instrument not only of economic stabilization, but will also help to prevent the country being cursed by these natural resources. You have said it loud. We are adding, and it is in fact in that context that this international webinar series is held in terms of setting the framework and setting the tone of conversation so that key institutions such as the central bank, such as parliament, such as government, they would allow a multi-stakeholder engagement towards a sustainable fund which will be used in a way that it enhances not only development but also good governance. Once again, thank you very much. We are together in this process, and we look forward into further engagements. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I will invite Dr. Nzira de Deus. Nzira de Deus is the director of Forum Mulher in Mozambique. Fórum Mulher is the vibrant and vital organization that is working for the advancement of rights of women in this country. It's a feminist organization. So they have a particular take, they have a particular look into these issues of development, particularly of how wealth sovereign funds can be used to harness that. Without further ado, I hand over to you. It's with you.
Muito obrigada, Dr. Adriano, e muito obrigada por convidar-nos para esta conversa, para este encontro, sobre um tema que é do interesse de todas as cidadãs, todos os cidadãos, mas poucos têm tido a oportunidade de aprofundar a discussão sobre o mesmo. Discutir fundo soberano com mulheres rurais, camponesas, não é de todo assim muito fácil. Parece um assunto que está muito distante do seu dia a dia. Dizer que o Fórum Mulher é uma rede nacional e é membro do Fórum de Monitoria do Orçamento e tem estado a participar como rede neste espaço para, de fato, acompanhar quais são as discussões e como é que estas discussões também terminam em resultados concretos para a melhoria da vida das mulheres e dos homens, vida de toda a sociedade, não é? E o que nos ressalta, assim, logo ao de cima, tem sido as questões que têm se levantado nas comunidades sobre como é que, de facto, este Fundo Soberano poderá beneficiar e contribuir para a melhoria da vida das populações. Como é que este fundo pode vir a ser gerido de forma diferente dos outros anteriores, dos quais tivemos algumas más experiências, um pouco baseadas no que os outros oradores que me precederam mencionaram, esta questão da falta de transparência, a exclusão e tudo mais. E a reflexão que trazemos aqui como organizações da sociedade civil, Fórum de Monitoria do Orçamento e outras, é que o Fundo Soberano deve ser, de fato, uma solução e não um problema. Esta maldição da abundância, a maldição dos recursos naturais, deve ser um processo de desenvolvimento para todo o país e baseado numa abordagem híbrida, né? Poupança, estabilização, em que todas as partes interessadas participem deste processo. Falamos do banco comercial, falamos da sociedade civil, Ministério, acadêmicos, o público em geral. Portanto, extrapolar este lugar de poucos, mas fazer este processo inclusivo e que há espaço para todos terem voz. Há uma necessidade de não só de projetar um modelo do Fundo Soberano que se adapte à situação macroeconômica do país em específico, mas também criar instrumentos e aplicar estes instrumentos que possam assegurar uma boa governação deste fundo, dos que lá fora que não se afundem no fundo, né? Haja de facto, a garantia de transparência. E o presidente Nilce mencionou muito bem, dizendo que este fundo deve funcionar de forma independente, com transparência, previsibilidade e no respeito estrito da lei. Eu não estou para fazer nenhum discurso, mas talvez para trazer estas reflexões introdutórias em jeito de boas-vindas aos que estão aqui conosco. Portanto, propomos esta concepção de um modelo híbrido, ancorados em princípios de boa governação e gestão transparente, promovendo boas práticas de prestação de contas, um investimento prudente a longo prazo e não investimentos que sejam feitos sem nenhum retorno visível, um diálogo aberto, inclusive, e uma compreensão mais profunda de quais são as atividades que se propõem a levar a cabo. temos consciência que no nosso país, a forma como a governação é feita, é difícil que os partidos interfiram na gestão deste tipo de fundos. Portanto, há uma interferência, há uma influência destes, e nós esperamos que não seja o caso deste fundo, que haja uma ausência ou neutralidade do partidos, no caso, principalmente o partido no poder, de se eximir de querer controlar a gestão e a governação e todo esse processo de decisão, de decisões que acontecem neste fundo. E os que lá estiverem, que tenham consciência de que estão lá para servir e não para usufruir só dos benefícios. Foram mencionados alguns exemplos positivos, como a gestão da Caora Bassa. Eu não sei se, de fato, são estudos que já foram apontados que é possível termos uma boa gestão financeira pública, a Caora Bassa, a Companhia de Hidrocarburetos, não sei. Talvez até agora tenham dado exemplos de bom sucesso, mas também temos exemplos negativos. Portanto, o processo da definição do modelo que estrutura o Fundo Soberano em Moçambique deve conter esta particular atenção na boa governação, atendendo ao nosso contexto, e seja um catalisador, de facto, de uma participação massiva dos cidadãos em busca de uma melhoria na condição de vida da nossa população. Falo particularmente daqueles grupos mais vulneráveis, que são as mulheres, que são os jovens, que continuam tendo uma esperança de um futuro melhor. Em nossa ótica, este princípio orientador deve seguir neste nosso debate de buscar refletir como trazer bons exemplos. Temos aqui vários oradores que podem ajudar a nós, como sociedade civil, como cidadãos, a aconselhar os melhores caminhos a tomar, já nos colocando neste lugar de detentor de voz e de sujeitos de direito, que temos obrigação de contribuir e depois melhorar também, monitorar, este todo o processo. A minha recomendação, talvez, para o CDD, professor Luvunga, permita-me dizer isto, é que nós continuemos este debate, estas iniciativas. Precisamos nos apropriar mais destes processos, precisamos de divulgar de uma forma mais popular, para que todos possamos trazer aquilo que são as nossas reflexões. E com isto eu queria agradecer e desejar a todos nós um bom debate. Espero que no final saiamos muito mais fortalecidos e construídos nesta discussão. E muito obrigada a todas e a todos.
Muito obrigado, doutora Anzira de Deus, pelas palavras bastante sábias, orientadas para o enquadramento deste Fundo Soberano, não só ele, no fim, mas a sua feitura, que deve ser catalisador da participação, catalisador de boa governação e catalisador, particularmente, do empoderamento dos grupos desfavorecidos, dos grupos que historicamente não estiveram favorecidos, nomeadamente mulheres, jovens e outros com necessidades específicas. Muito obrigado. Sem demora, vou convidar o Dr. Rui Mate para tecer comentários rápidos, para já irmos à fala do Dr. Charles. Dr. Rui Mate, é consigo.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Agradecer o convite que foi feito para tecer esses pequenos comentários de abertura neste webinar. Eu estou aqui em representação da plataforma da sociedade civil sobre recursos naturais e indústria extrativa. Dizer que esta é uma plataforma que alberga organizações afiliadas. Ela foi criada em 2009 e fortaleceu-se após a assinatura de um memorando de entendimento entre os seus membros em 2011. Ela visa essencialmente advogar por uma exploração sustentável de recursos naturais e também pela utilização transparente, responsável e equitativa dos resultados provenientes da exploração desses mesmos recursos. Então, este objetivo que a plataforma tem de promover uma exploração transparente e uma distribuição equitativa dos recursos leva àquilo que é a importância dessa discussão que é trazida aqui neste webinar, que é o objetivo de termos uma exploração sustentável de recursos que não nos leve àquilo que é denominado de maldição de recursos. Sabemos nós que nos últimos anos, com essa descoberta de recursos aqui no país, há aqui grandes expectativas em relação a que ganhos é que esses recursos vão trazer ao país. Está todo mundo à espera que, em pouco espaço de tempo, o país se desenvolva e isto provoca uma melhoria na vida de toda a população. Mas, como foi dito anteriormente pelos painelistas que me antecederam, há experiências de alguns países que viveram esta situação de abundância de recursos, que, no entanto, os resultados que foram esperados não foram os desejados. E, com base nessas experiências, sabendo também que Moçambique está nesta fase embrionária da sua exploração, pode-se, através de mecanismos aprendidos dessas experiências, buscarmos alternativas para fugir a esta maldição de recursos, que é uma das alternativas, é esta que é trazida nessa discussão, que é a criação de um fundo soberano. E este foi aquilo que é a gestão desses recursos que provém da indústria extrativa, prever também aquilo que é os efeitos negativos que ele pode trazer para o resto dos setores da economia, uma vez que se espera grandes recursos deste setor, ele pode provocar distorções no resto da economia. Então, é preciso que haja uma gestão criteriosa para que estes prováveis efeitos negativos não ocorram. Se nós formos a olhar atualmente como é feita a gestão das receitas de minerais em Moçambique, ela é alocada na medida em que o orçamento que é virado muito para o consumo e não para a criação de investimentos estruturantes que possam garantir retornos de longo prazo. E sabemos nós que os recursos naturais são esgotáveis. Eles devem garantir o bem-estar da geração atual e também da geração futura, porque eles são esgotáveis. Então, não pode haver aqui um benefício apenas para uma geração e não para outra. Então, é preciso que haja um mecanismo que possa garantir esta utilização racional desses recursos e garantir a sua sustentabilidade para o longo deste período. Então, o Fundo Soberano é um mecanismo que pode ajudar a minimizar esses desastres. Então, a plataforma tem interesse nessa discussão, tem interesse em como é que este fundo vai ser introduzido, que tipo de fundo é que o país pretende, quais são os objetivos deste fundo, como é que este fundo vai ser gerido, quais serão os mecanismos para a sua gestão, como é que nós havemos de garantir a transparência e a prestação dos fundos. E julgamos nós que estes todos elementos só vão ser conseguidos se, desde o princípio da criação do fundo, todos estiverem envolvidos, isto é, haver debates nacionais de forma aberta para que se enriqueçam as propostas já avançadas. Na terça-feira, o administrador do Banco de Moçambique avançou que já existe uma proposta técnica sobre a criação de um fundo que até o final do ano já se terá uma proposta para ser discutida a nível nacional. Nós julgamos que essa proposta deve ser debatida a nível nacional para que todos possam contribuir e haja consensos relativamente a esta proposta que é trazida, porque a plataforma julga que o fundo irá evitar a maldição de recursos se ele tiver todos os elementos de gestão transparentes, que tragam realmente benefício à sociedade, que seja para criar retornos a esta geração e a geração futura. Caso contrário, teremos situações de experiências negativas, como é o caso da Angola e Nigéria, que já tinha citado a diretora da Oxfam, mas podemos também aprender com experiências positivas, que é esta que havemos ter a oportunidade de ter hoje, que é do Timor-Leste, que é uma das experiências que é evidenciada neste processo de exploração de recursos. Então, em linhas gerais, queria só dizer que a plataforma agradece pelo convite e tem muito interesse na discussão deste tema, porque o envolvimento de todos, desde o início até a sua concepção, é importante para garantir e evitar que os efeitos negativos ou as despesas do país. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Rui Mata. Sem demorar muito, I will invite our guest speaker today. Our guest speaker is Charles Scheiner. Charles Scheiner has been a researcher at Hamutuk, the East Timor Institute for Development Monitoring and Analysis, since 2001. He specializes on the effects of oil and gas extraction on the people of Timor-Leste, including economic ability and revenue management. He has written and presented widely on Timor-Leste experiences and advocates for development pathways that are sustainable and equitable to fulfill the rights of all people in the 18-year-old nation, which is Timor-Leste. Without further ado, I will invite Charles Scheiner to take us through the Timorese experience. Charles, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adriano. I feel very privileged to be able to participate in this conference. I'm in New York right now, but I've spent most of the last 20 years in Timor-Leste. Let me start with a PowerPoint, and I'll try to address some of the issues that people talked about and people have asked about in the chat. Can you see the PowerPoint now? Is that working?
Yes, it's working perfectly. Perfectly.
So what I want to talk about this morning is one second, sorry. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, which Timor-Leste calls its Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Petroleum Fund, is not a solution to every problem that can exist in the economy. It doesn't prevent conflict. It doesn't force the government to appropriate money in the right ways. but it can help with some things. And in Timor-Leste, we've had now 15 years experience with the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so I think maybe there are some things to learn from experience. Timor-Leste is different than Mozambique in some ways, and it's similar in some ways. It's much smaller in population and in land area. It's been independent for a shorter period of time, but it's been peaceful for a longer period of time. There have not been major conflicts since the Indonesian occupation ended. And one of the speakers earlier referred to it as a civil war. It wasn't a civil war, it was a foreign invasion and occupation. And we have a lot of very poor people, but the overall economic indicators are somewhat better than Mozambique. However, we have used up almost all of our oil and gas. There's not much left. When Timor-Leste started discussing creating a sovereign wealth fund in 2004, there were some reasons to be concerned that the resource curse in our country could be even worse than in other countries. It was a new country. We had no history of democracy, and most of our citizens had never lived under a democracy. And because it had been a series of resistance to foreign occupation, to Portuguese colonialism for 4 centuries, and then to Indonesian occupation for 24 years, people were not used to participating in government because the government's never welcomed public participation. We also had to create a new governmental system, legal structure, institutions, all from scratch. And there were very few people that had experience in these kind of institutions. And we had a tradition of corruption from Indonesia and bureaucratic inefficiency from Portugal. And then we had 2.5 years of United Nations transitional government, which brought in many people that didn't understand the country and were there for a very short period of time. The other concern, and this wasn't known in 2004, but it's become clear since then, is that we are very dependent on the revenue from oil and gas, more than almost any country in the world. But we also had some advantages, that we weren't the first country to start oil and gas production, so we could learn from other people, other countries' experiences, as you are trying to do now. That people had fought very hard for national sovereignty and against military occupation for democratic rule. And there was a strong civil society, and people then in 2004 and still today value national sovereignty and democracy very highly, which means that we've had, for example, I think 4 changes of government through elections since independence. And then another advantage is that our oil reserves primarily are out in the ocean. They're not in Timor-Leste's territory, so you don't have the economic and social environmental impacts on local communities where the extraction is. And the kind of conflicts that Timor-Leste, that Mozambique is having now in Cabo Delgado, we haven't had those problems, at least so far. I'm not going to go into great detail about economy. There are a lot of numbers on this slide, but just to show that, for example, last year, most of our revenues came from investments of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And we got some from oil and gas revenues, and we got a little bit from what they call domestic revenues, every other kind of taxes and fees and government revenue generating activity that the country can have. And similarly, in our state budget, the overwhelming majority of it is paid for with the transfer from the Sovereign Wealth Fund. This creates a not very healthy economy because almost all of the economy depends on state spending, and the state spending all depends on oil money. So when the oil money is gone, and I use the word oil to refer to both oil and natural gas, which is LNG. When this is gone, there will be not much left. And it's one of the failures of the fund and of Timor-Leste so far, as they have not been very successful in diversifying the economy. And then, as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, the petroleum industry provides very little spin-off into the local economy. It employs almost nobody. Less than 1/10% of the workforce of Timor-Leste works in the petroleum industry. And most of the subcontracts go to foreign companies. So the only way that it helps Timor-Leste is through the money that it provides for the government. When the fund was being discussed in 2004, 2005, there were a number of objectives that were set up. One was to separate oil revenues from state spending, because oil revenues go up and down and they will end. Oil is a non-renewable resource. And the state has to continue after that. And the state spending should depend on the needs of the population, not on what the world market price of oil happens to be in a given year. Similarly, it was supposed to stabilize the state budget against changes in production and oil price. It was supposed to earn return on investments so that it would be sustainable after the oil and gas was used up. And in the preamble to the legislation, and it gets repeated over and over again, the fund is for the benefit of current and future generations. Now, in reality, that may not work more than one future generation, but that was the idea. That it would help with transparency and good management, as some of the speakers earlier mentioned, that it would reduce corruption, that it would help democratic and openness about decisions about state spending and about how the oil money was used, and that the investment was to earn revenues. In the webinar that CDD had last week about Nigeria, there was a lot of discussion about investing the fund in the Nigerian economy to help develop the country. And Timor-Leste decided not to do that. They decided that when they want to use money from the fund to develop the country, to develop the economy, that should be withdrawn from the fund and invested through the state budget. It shouldn't be directly spent from the fund into the local economy. Now, there have been some changes in the last few years, but that's where it is right now. So the underlying principle of this theory is that revenue from oil and gas is not income. It's a conversion of wealth from one form, from the form of oil and gas deposits in the ground, to another form, which in Timor-Leste's case is US dollars, different currency, but to money. And therefore, petroleum revenue that comes to the government is different from the other tax revenues, which are generated by economic activity, not by depleting a non-renewable resource. And so that as the petroleum reserves draw down, the balance in the fund is supposed to increase, providing a continual source of the same amount of revenue in real terms, meaning corrected for inflation over time. This slide was actually a slide that was used during the public consultations in the process of developing the fund. And there's a theory called the estimated sustainable income, which is that if this amount of money, 3% of the balance of the fund, plus the net present value of future oil and gas revenues from fields that are already under development plans, not from hypothetical future fields that may or may not exist, but from fields that already have approved development plans. If that amount of money is withdrawn from the fund each year, it could provide a constant source of funding forever. In practice, this theory hasn't been so great. Firstly, the return on investment is often less than 3%. Secondly, providing a fixed amount of money is not necessarily what the country needs. The population increases, prices of goods increases, people's expectations for government services increase. And so that the fixed amount of money actually turns out to be front loading. It turns out to be more money at the beginning of the process than it will be further on, which maybe is a good thing, but it wasn't sort of recognized at the time. That very often the spending, the amount taken out of the fund is more than the 3%. And that the rules, because they're established by a democratic process, by parliament, they can be changed by parliament. And so that the petroleum fund law has been revised 3 times in Timor-Leste's history. When the law was originally established, these were the basic principles of it. All oil and gas revenue goes directly into the petroleum fund, is paid by the oil companies into the fund. The fund is invested outside the country in liquid instruments and stocks and bonds that are traded on international markets. It started out primarily or almost entirely in United States government bonds, but it's now been diversified and it has bonds from other countries, and also about 40% of the fund is invested in the international stock market. That it requires parliamentary approval to take money out of the fund, which is normally done as part of the annual state budget. That there are reports published, there's public consultation, there's transparency. That's worked fairly well. The fund cannot be used as collateral for borrowing from the World Bank or other similar institutions. The guideline about the estimated sustainable income that I first mentioned. And as I said, the fund has been revised 3 times since then. So this is how the money flowed in 2012. The numbers are from 2012, but the basic flows are the same. That companies buy oil and gas from the international companies that extract it and produce it from underground. That money is paid to those oil companies. Those oil companies pay taxes and royalties. And originally the oil and gas fields were in a joint development area with Australia. That's no longer true, but because of that, 10% of the revenues at that time went to Australia and 90% came to Timor-Leste. They all came into the petroleum fund. The investment income from the fund was also redeposited into the fund, and money was transferred out of the fund each year, both the sustainable income and usually more above the sustainable income into the state budget. The state budget also receives money from autonomous agencies like the state electricity agency and some tax revenues. And then the state budget, as proposed by government and approved by Parliament, takes money out of the fund and uses it for basically everything that the state does. Recurrent expenditures, capital expenditures, and in 2012, they actually took more out of the fund than they can spend, so some of it was carried over into 2013. There were some comments before about governance, and this is the governance process very roughly, but it's complicated and I'm not going to go through it in detail. But basically you can see the central bank is the manager of the fund with external advisors. The Ministry of Finance sets the management policies and has some external inputs to its process. The Council of Ministers approves the budget, the draft budget, and then the Parliament approves the final budget. There is a consultative council that advises Parliament, and that includes members of civil society and former government officials and people chosen by different elements of Timor-Leste society. And then the fund itself is used to fund the state budget. So now we have 15 years of experience, right? The fund was established in 2005, it's 2020. And Timor-Leste has avoided spending the oil money as fast as it comes in. There is, and I forgot to point this out in the previous, back here, the history of the fund until the middle of this year, it's received $23 billion in oil and gas revenues. It's received about $7 billion in return on investments. About $12 billion has been taken out of the fund so far for funding state activities. And there's $18 billion balance in the fund right now. Out of that $12 billion, 7.5 was the estimated sustainable income and 4.5 was above the estimated sustainable income. So if we look at how the fund has worked so far, we've avoided having the state budget go up and down with oil prices. We've avoided having a lot of money disappear. There's some corruption, as there is in most countries, but there's not been money disappeared out of the fund that nobody knows where it went. We have some balance that's saved, which is different, I think, than Nigeria and Ghana. And we have not had foreign invasion and occupation and war. Or internal, there have been some internal conflicts, but nothing to the level of a major war. However, the fund is being depleted because more than the money, sustainable income is being removed. The return on investment is not as secure at 3% as the designers of the fund had hoped. The law has been weakened a few times, and so investments are now less secure than they were initially. And there's been a national oil company created of Timor-Leste that was created in 2011, which is much less accountable than the fund. So if we look at the history of the money so far, you can see the oil and gas revenue started in 2005. There's red and white checkerboard thing is oil and gas revenues. That started in 2005. It increased rapidly until 2014, and then it declined fairly rapidly, and the expectations in the future are pretty low. Return on investment, which is the blue and white sections, excuse me, grew as the fund grew, and now is much larger than oil revenues. So we are not an oil-dependent country anymore, we're an investment-dependent country. And domestic revenues, non-oil revenues, has grown slightly, but it's still much less than the revenue from other sources. But return on investments, as I said, can be negative. It was negative in 2015. It was negative by a lot in 2018. These predictions are the parts from 2020 to 2024 are projections made by the Ministry of Finance last year before COVID. So they may not be accurate. And the lines show how much was spent. The black line is how much the state budget spent, the government spent every year, and the red line is how much was taken out of the petroleum fund every year. So you can see that the petroleum fund funds almost all of the state budget, and the projections for the future is that that would continue. So that when there is no more sovereign wealth fund, Timor-Leste is going to be in very serious trouble. There was a change to the fund last year where they took $650 million out of the fund. They actually don't call it having withdrawn it from the fund. They call it a loan from the fund to the National Oil Company to buy into an oil and gas project. And that change was enabled by some legal changes, revisions of the law, so that Timor-Leste now is a partner in the one future oil and gas project that has a proven reserve, although it's not being developed yet. And it may be possible that that project, which is called Greater Sunrise, will produce some money and repay the loan, but it also may be possible that it will not. The country is now very optimistic about future oil and gas revenues. This is one element of the resource curse that Mozambique, I think, needs to be careful about. That when you've gotten a lot of oil and money from oil and gas, people think that money will continue forever, but it won't, because oil and gas is a non-renewable resource, and once it's been extracted and sold, it's not there anymore. So Timor-Leste right now is doing a licensing round. All of these areas with letters on them, offshore in green and onshore in pink, are being offered to international oil companies to come in and do new exploration. But the reality is, in the past, all these gray areas were already explored. For more than 100 years, it's been oil and gas exploration in Timor-Leste. So there may or may not be further oil and gas to be found. And even these orange areas that are already under contract, except for this one and this one here, there's no guarantee that they're going to be commercially viable. They're future possibilities. So if we look at the situation right now, there, except for the possibility of Greater Sunrise, there's little likelihood of significant oil revenue in the future. And 97% of the money from the fields that are currently in production has already been received. The needs keep going up, the population increases, the expectations increase, the cost of maintenance infrastructure that's been built increases. Financial markets in the United States, which still is where the majority of the fund is invested, and around the world, are very uncertain. About 5% of the fund that was loaned to the National Oil Company is not tradable anymore. There's sort of no way to get it back by selling that assets. And the long-term future of the oil and gas industry is dubious. Renewable energy is getting cheaper and more competitive. And the emergency from climate change, which, you're on the east side of the Indian Ocean. I'm sorry, you're on the west side of the Indian Ocean. Timor-Leste is on the east side of the Indian Ocean. On the north side of the Indian Ocean is Bangladesh, where half the country is underwater right now. So there's going to be inevitably a global movement away from the use of fossil fuels, but we don't know when that's going to happen. Challenges that we still face are there's pretty good transparency, but there's limited capacity in the media, in civil society, and the general public to analyze and understand that information and what it means. resisting the temptation to overspend or just to invest in speculative investments that could lose money is difficult. Ensuring that development reaches everybody in the country in Timor-Leste, and I think this probably happens in Mozambique also, the capital gets a disproportionate share of public investment so that people in rural areas remain poor. And also women and other vulnerable groups are often not, don't receive a share of the income, preventing money from being stolen. I mean, that's so far been successful, but it's not a guarantee. Making the national oil company more transparent and accountable. There was a change in leadership of the national oil company last month for the first time since its existence. And hopefully the new leadership will be moving in that direction. And the most important challenge, and the one that we've been least successful in, is developing an economy that doesn't depend on oil. So that the elements of the resource curse still exist. Unfortunately, spending is unsustainable. People want to imagine that oil and gas will last forever. Planning is not very effective. Petroleum operations are treated in a privileged way with rules that don't apply to the rest of the economy. I won't talk about these more because I've already mentioned them and you know them. So the lessons basically are that a sovereign wealth fund and transparency can help, but they're not enough to prevent the resource curse. There are a lot of other things that are necessary. That it's pretty easy to make the rules before the money comes in, and it's good that Mozambique is starting to do that as well. But that once there is a lot of money, it's harder to maintain them and to follow them. People's expectations were too high. I remember a conversation I had in 2004 with someone from USAID when they were promoting creating the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I said, can you tell me an example of a country where a Sovereign Wealth Fund has prevented the resource curse? And they said, Botswana. And I said, I mean, a petroleum dependent country. Botswana's wealth comes from diamonds, not from petroleum. And petroleum has a very different market than diamonds do. And they couldn't think of an example. And I think now, even 15 years later, it's hard to think of an example. People talk about Norway, but Norway is very different from Mozambique or from Timor-Leste. And it's not dependent on its extractive resources. It's also easy to change laws. Even if you create a good system, it may not last forever. It's easy to overspend. And civil society is not as strong as it could be and it should be. So I think I'll stop there, and there's a lot more information on our website, and I have many other slides too. If people have questions, we can go and look at some of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles Scheiner, for this brilliant presentation on the Timor-Leste experience with its wealth sovereign fund. Lots of food for thought here. You have clear and loudly said that the Timorese sovereign fund was important, was instrumental for managing its windfall income that come at one go, but you have seen trends when the expenditures, the withdrawal from the fund, almost exceeding the revenues. You have said that politicians can change the law so easily in order to benefit now from the fund. You have talked about the participation of a civil society, but understandably, from a country without, as you have said, without an experience, a democratic experience, and a really very, very young country. It's only, as you have indicated, 18 years old. I think they have done brilliantly, the Timorese people, and people like you and the colleagues from the Lao Hamutuk. They have done great work. But you conclude by saying this kind of fund, sovereign wealth fund, they can help, but much more is needed to prevent resource scarce. This is where our discussion today lies, and your input is really an important one to help us to frame the discussion on how Mozambique's process of establishing the fund and later on the management of the fund can not only help to mitigate the shocks when they come, due to volatility, but also catalyze governance and improve fiscal transparency. We still believe, but you have said, when the money is in, when politicians receive the money, they don't listen. They don't listen. Politicians, when they have the money, they don't listen. So because of that, we think it is the right thing to do to have the discussion way much earlier, not only as a way of capacity building, but also of a kind of setting things right, setting governance right. Dr. Ratafina Donko was saying institutions are key. Institutions matter. The World Bank says that, and I concur with them. And Barack Obama said it when he came to Africa as president the first time. He said institutions matter. In fact, they matter more than good and strong leaders. It is with this that I'm inviting now our two discussants. I will start from Dr. Marcelina Joel to give a few comments, and then Dr. Anibal Balango. Over to you, Dr. Marcelina Joel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to all from sharing the experience and also the concerns about how the process should be carried out in Mozambique. And we therefore thank to our main speaker, Dr. Charles Scheiner, by sharing with us the Timorese experience. I saw that the Timor, by law at least, it has created the Sovereign Wealth Fund in 2005, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And from 2005, you have shared also the experience on the management of the fund, and also the concerns or the challenge that the Timor people or government or society is facing regarding this management of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So from what you have said and the problems that the Timorese people are facing on management, and also the flexibility of the changing of the law, perhaps it leads us to think better on how to establish this fund. Of course, as I said, the government of Mozambique is engaged in this discussion since 2014, when the petroleum law and mining law were updated, and this issue came up and still ongoing. So all we need is to learn more and get the do's and don'ts, so that we don't probably repeat the mistakes, or we don't follow the mistakes that the others or the previous countries that has done or has gone through. So the brainstorming that we're having on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think it's important in a way that we will better establish our law or the principles, mainly the ways of management, the ways of accessing these funds, and probably if we're talking about the investments, which kind of projects should be eligible to be financed through this fund, and how this fund should be monitored, and how people can also meet their needs today. Because from our experience, we had, for instance, that this fund for the investments, it should be channeled to investments like for training the people, for capacity for them to manage this fund, and also to create infrastructures which will also generate income now and in the future. And also the education, because I believe that the education, it also falls in that principle of training the people to manage the revenues today, and also create the means to support the future generation. So from the Timor experience, what they saw is that it went well, maybe in the beginning, but when there was a change of this law, because this law was weakened to allow, for instance, the ease or the flexible access to this fund. And I think there is where everything happened. And today, for instance, we cannot say that this is a good example to be followed by us. Or at least I did not see from your presentation what takeaways we could have from the Timor experience on how they are managing, how they establish it, and how, for instance, how they do elect or select the projects that could be benefiting or could be financed by these sovereign wealth funds. I'm happy that I'm glad that we are here with our parliamentarian member, which I respect, and I thank you for being with us, because these discussions, it leads for us to prepare today for the future, but I would say for the near future, because I agree also with the idea that we should prepare and have our sovereign funds, at least the legal framework now, so that we avoid all the constraints on the rushing to establish or to approve the laws when the funds or the revenues are already in our banks or in our pockets, which would be difficult to see clear problems that could be foreseen and avoided through the necessary legal framework provisions that will lead us to get a transparent and very, how can I say, very robust fund that would help to establish our economy. So to you, Dr. Charles, I would like to know when the Timor-Leste discovered or starts to exploit the oil, and because the fund was established in 2005. So when the Timor-Leste did start exploitation of the oil and gas, and who was managing this fund? Was a central bank, a national bank, or the fund was sitting, for instance, abroad and generating revenues from interest, for instance, or the fund was sitting in the country and being managed by independent entity that was created, because I didn't see that, and I'm sorry if that was in your presentation. I could not figure it out. And how much money shall be designated or dedicated to the sovereign funds, and how much money should go if there is to establish the state budget annually, of how much, or what is the periodicity, or how much, for instance, they can go to the sovereign fund, or it's only for the emergency situation, or it's only for the investment, or what can be, what projects can be eligible to be financed by this fund. And if there's a percentage of this fund for the projects, and if foreigner people, for instance, can come with the projects that can be financed by this sovereign wealth fund, or it's only for local citizens. And maybe the second, maybe the last question from now will be from the experience, from the Timor experience that you have shared with us. What went wrong? What could be avoided, so that we can also take advantage that we are still in the process and avoid such mistakes in our case. And I can stop from now, and thanking you for listening me, and perhaps I can intervene later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcelina. Thank you very much for those enlightening comments, and particularly the questions that you have asked to Dr. Charles, and then you were clear on this since the beginning. Your emphasis is on how would one save if he's hungry today. How can one save for the future if he or she is starving today, and Mozambique is facing dire needs in infrastructure? How can a country like this one pretend to save if it is facing? But what is being said, not only by literature, but by examples and experiences all over the world, is that a green light to spend everything today, it's a recipe for collapse, which will further jeopardize the much needed growth and much needed institutional and infrastructure development. So there's a need for equilibrium here. But let us take Dr. Nibal Malango. Over to you, Malango.
Muito obrigado por mais uma vez estarmos juntos para este debate, e também agradecer o fato de, neste período, estarmos a acolher a experiência dos outros países, e parabenizar a apresentação que nós tivemos hoje sobre o Timor-Leste, e aprendemos muito. Penso que eu vou sumarizar os meus comentários, primeiro reconhecendo um desafio que o nosso presidente da primeira comissão para os assuntos constitucionais nos colocou, quando nos coloca uma previsão daquilo que se espera que sejam encaixes fiscais em razão da exploração do gás natural na bacia do Rio. E o que nós queremos garantir é o nosso comprometimento, no sentido de que todo o valor que for destinado para que seja arrecadado para os cofres do Estado, que a autoridade tributária irá fazer, por quanto tem como essas atribuições, que é garantir a arrecadação das receitas para os cofres do Estado. Ora, nós esperamos que, com este dinheiro que se espera da exploração desses recursos, seja por via da criação de um fundo, seja por via de qualquer tipo de alocação que a lei assim permitir, por via da lei orçamental ou por via de uma outra lei ordinária qualquer, o nosso desiderato é que haja alargamento de uma base tributária. Isto queremos dizer o quê? Que os investimentos devem ser feitos com este valor devem garantir maior empregabilidade das pessoas, por forma a termos mais pessoas com rendimento ou empreendimentos que vão gerar receitas que serão efetivamente tributáveis e vão evitar aquilo que nós estamos aqui a discutir, a dependência apenas das receitas do setor extrativo. Portanto, nós achamos isso muito crítico, que efetivamente os gastos relativos às receitas provenientes desse setor devem ajudar a dinamizar a nossa economia. Mas também temos a oportunidade hoje de ouvir as experiências dos outros e estamos a ver que há necessidade de aprimorarmos o quadro legal. Nós temos a distância que nos separa entre os anos que espera-se que a produção do gás natural comece na bacia do Rovuma, pode nos permitir, sim, acolher essas experiências e melhor legislar. Portanto, temos essa vantagem, se calhar, que os outros países não tiveram. E por via disso, fomos notando que eles foram fazendo updates também daquilo que é a sua legislação, por forma a ajustar os fundos que eles foram criando. Mas também gostaria de partilhar alguns dados, como o desafio que se coloca entre uma receita que vai ser arrecadada num país em que ainda permanece com um déficit fiscal. O déficit fiscal em Moçambique continua assente no orçamento geral do Estado. Estamos a falar de uma média de 40% do déficit. Portanto, as nossas receitas internas apenas financiam 60%, cerca de 60%. E estamos a ver que dados atuais de instituições como o Banco Africano de Desenvolvimento indicam para uma recessão econômica de 3,4%, e por via disso espera-se um déficit orçamental que esteja na ordem de 8% a 9% do PIB. Ora, nós temos de estar claros que essas situações serão recorrentes também quando nós tivermos este fundo a funcionar. Portanto, temos a oportunidade hoje de pensar, ao legislar, como é que nós iremos tratar em situações, em situações em que tenhamos pandemia, não gostaríamos que voltássemos a ter pandemia dessa natureza, mas situações de calamidades que tratam um cenário para o qual nós estávamos preparados, por quanto nós estávamos com uma expectativa de crescimento, mas hoje estamos com uma perspectiva totalmente diferente, que é uma perspectiva de recessão, e isto terá impacto certamente nas receitas do Estado. Qual é o desafio que se coloca ao Estado numa situação dessa? E a outra questão que eu gostaria de perceber de Timor-Leste é, efetivamente, como é que as receitas, qual é a contribuição das receitas do setor do petróleo e gás nas receitas do Estado e quanto é que está a ser canalizado para a despesa referente a um determinado exercício econômico. E, mais uma vez, termino agradecendo esta oportunidade e este debate que está nos a abrir a mente para vermos como é que nós devemos nos preparar para esta nova era em que nós também seremos produtores e exportadores do gás natural. Obrigado.
Dr. Mbalango, Dr. Nibal, thank you so much. I'm sure Charles, you will have followed his comments, but what Nibal Mbalango was saying is that, okay, this is important to think about such architecture to manage this wealth that is coming from windfall incomes, such as extractive industries. But again, there is the issue of budget deficit. And Mozambique's current budget deficit is around 40%. And how can you think about saving with such a deficit, and also the debt, and also looking at the issues of natural disasters, which often hit the country. But look now where we are with COVID-19. So how do you balance that? Where do the incentive structures come from to move for such an architecture in a context where you like the very basic in your own country, and people look at that as the game changer, and the expectations are so high in a growing population, etc. So I will hand over to you now, Charles, to in 5 minutes address those comments. Then I'll give an opportunity to our distinguished panelists to make their comments, and then I will open up the floor. Over to you, Charles. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to answer the questions. It's a lot to cover in 5 minutes. Dr. Joel asked when Timor-Leste discovered oil, and that timeline is intertwined with the country's independence. That the major oil and gas reserves that have provided most of the money were discovered in 1994, when the country was under Indonesian occupation. And oil companies were reluctant to invest the billions of dollars to develop those fields while the area was conflicted. And so they waited. And then in 1999, after the overthrow of the Indonesian dictatorship, Timor-Leste's people had a chance to have a referendum on independence, and they voted overwhelmingly to become independent after 24 years of occupation. And then there was a 2.5-year UN transitional government. And during that time, the basic contracts and rules and things like that made the companies feel comfortable were developed. But only after independence on the 20th of May, 2002, did the serious investment start. And so oil production started in 2005, well, 2004, really. Initially, the gas was re-injected because the infrastructure wasn't ready, and gas revenues in a significant way started in 2006. So the process of creating the fund was happening simultaneous with the development of the oil and gas infrastructure, but before significant production started. On the question of who manages the fund, let me share my screen again. This is it's a complicated graph, but basically the Central Bank of Timor-Leste does the day-to-day management. And they contract out to some external investment advisors who are mostly foreign companies. A few of them are foreign investment banks, to do the trading of the stocks and bonds and to decide exactly what stock to buy. But the rules of the fund are that no more than 5% of the fund can be invested in any one company or any one country, and so, except US bonds. So that the external advisors have to follow pretty strict standards. But there's an investment agreement that's developed by the Ministry of Finance and signed with the central bank that sets the overall parameters, what percentages in stocks, what percentages in bonds, things like that. So the central bank is an independent, non-political, in theory, institution. The Ministry of Finance is a political institution because it's chosen by the elected government. And so you have this sort of dual responsibility there. The central bank does not have the power to set major policies. That's all done by the Ministry of Finance. But the central bank is responsible for the reporting and things like that. They do monthly, quarterly, and annual reports about the fund's income, the fund's expenditures, how the money's invested. The annual report actually has a list of every stock and bond that they own. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. So there's a fair amount of transparency there. The question of how much of the fund was dedicated for what? When Timor-Leste established its fund, the idea was that it would cover the non-oil deficit in the state budget. So the government and the parliament would decide what the overall size of the budget they wanted was, how much revenue they had other than revenues from the petroleum fund, and whatever was left would be covered by a withdrawal from the fund. So that's not in the fund rules, that's in the process of the state budget. And so the fund is not spent on health, on education, on anything like that. That's all done through the state budget. And if we look last year, for example, this is the state budget. The government said that its priorities were education, health, agriculture, and water. But in terms of how they actually appropriated the money, less than 20% went for those four sectors, and much larger parts went for national roads, for the administration of the government, for the police and military, for social welfare programs, for veterans, pensions, for electricity. But in terms of economic diversification, in terms of future investment in the people of Timor-Leste, which are the most valuable resource of the country, much more valuable than oil and gas, that has not been as much as is needed, really. And so it's limited diversification of the economy. You can see the money invested in economic development is only 3% of the state budget, and agriculture, which is the livelihood of more than 2/3 of the Timorese families, only 2% was invested in agriculture. Only 1% was invested in water, even though there's very high child malnutrition, largely due to the lack of accessibility of clean water in most of the country. But more was invested in future oil projects, in ports that facilitate the import of goods, which makes it harder for local production to compete, airports for the 1% of the population that ever flies in an airplane. Timor-Leste is a small country. You don't need to fly to get around the country internally. So in terms of how much of the fund is dedicated for this, it's entirely part of the state budget. The fund itself is not invested in the country. The fund is invested in instruments that produce financial return. In terms of what mistakes can be avoided, I think it's hard to tell. I think the biggest one is, I think, expecting too much from the fund and not giving enough attention to other things. And that, you know, we are a democratic country. The parliamentarians are elected for 5-year terms and sometimes less if the governing majority collapses, which had happened in 2017. And politicians' planning horizon is the next election. It's not the next generation, right? So politicians will say, well, if we don't use the money now to benefit ourselves, we're not going to get reelected, and therefore we're not going to be able to do anything in the future. So it doesn't matter if there's money left in the fund or not. And the fund itself cannot force people to plan long-term. That's, I think, up to civil society and the voters to do. And I know Moçambique has not had a lot of changes of government due to elections. I think that's probably an area that needs as much attention as how the money from oil and gas is managed. In the Q&A text, somebody asked about EITI, and I just want to point out, Timor-Leste is a member of EITI and was the third country in the world to become certified as EITI compliant. And EITI is useful, but it's very slow. It's like 3 years after something happens that it's reflected in EITI reports. And that's too late to make major changes. So that the transparency that's built into the fund with reports every month, that's built into the state budget process, is much more useful than EITI in terms of supporting good governance. EITI is sort of like a check and balance that happens in the future. I didn't catch all of Dr. Annibal's comments, but to try to respond, Timor-Leste, like Mozambique, has tremendous problems. We have the highest rate of child malnutrition in the world, except for Afghanistan, higher than any African country. And we have very high levels of poverty, and it hasn't gotten much better in spite of all of this oil and gas wealth coming in. But that's not because of the fund, it's because of the way the state budget has allocated money. One difference with Mozambique is because we were a new country when the fund was established, we had no foreign debt. And even today, the foreign debt is very small, much less than the balance that's in the petroleum fund. So setting up the fund wasn't a trade-off with foreign debt. And the politicians often say, and especially the World Bank and the people promoting foreign loans, well, the interest we're going to charge on the loan is less than the interest that the return that you get on the fund. So don't take the money out of the fund to finance these things, borrow the money from us. The organization I work with, Hamutuk, thinks that that's not good advice, because if they take out loans now, when they have money, they'll have to repay them later when they don't have money, and it'll cause the austerity to be even more severe than it would be otherwise after the fund is used up. So I don't know if I got all the questions, but maybe I'll stop there and see if people have others.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much, Charles. You have nailed it. You clearly made the point that politicians have a short time horizon kind of a political game. So it is up to civil society, which has the possibility of a much longer perspective on how to go about their things, to critically reflect on how to shape a developmental, which is inclusive and also catalyzes governance. So I found that it can be instrumental in all that. I thank you for those comments. I will quickly ask my two distinguished panelists. Dr. Tofina Donko, are you there? Dr.
Yes, I'm
Tofina
here.
Donko, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Please, your justice, please.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think this was a very important space. And definitely, I would like, first of all, to address some of the questions that was brought to the table. And one of them was if the Sovereign Wealth Fund can be in a position to at least assist despite, conflict in Mozambique, and assist the institution and have stronger institutions. I would like to reiterate Dr. Marcelina's words, which are very important. And one thing that she said was that we need also to invest in the education sector. We need to ensure that at least we have people and our children capable of addressing issues that are linked to EI or natural resources that we are getting, so that at least we'll come out from bad deals, that we have contracts that are ongoing at the moment, and we are not able as a country to take advantage of. So basically, this is one of the questions that I just wanted to answer with regard to institutions, and I say that it's possible. And another important question that was raised was with regard to the fact that how do we balance investors and how do we leverage? How do we know? What is the acceptable percentage of investors? Definitely, the same thing, the same question I would say. It's like we need to go to the negotiation table when we know the issues, when we know and we have the skills. Otherwise, the other side will always be winning. You will not see Anadarko, you will not see any, you will not see Total come to the negotiation table with only one person. It's around 15, and maybe from our side, we just go one. So we need to be prepared. We need to understand our issues. But definitely, this was very enriching, and quite a lot of lessons learned from Timor-Leste for our country in Mozambique. Thank you, Dr. Adriano.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Rotafina Donko, for those remarks and taking some of the questions, particularly the issue of institutions and also the issue of Cabo Delgado, the extent to which this fund can be instrumental in addressing the conflict in Cabo Delgado. No doubt about that. No doubt. If good governance is allowed to shape this, this is one way of preempting further problems into the ones we have in Cabo Delgado. But if this fund is allowed to be used corruptly, then we will have more problems into what is going on in Cabo Delgado. But without further ado, I will invite President António Boene, the President of the Parliamentary Committee for Constitutional Affairs, Legality and Human Rights, to say a few words. Over to you, President. President Boene? Oh,
yes, I'm here. Okay. So I will talk in Portuguese because I'm very comfortable talking in português. Is that okay? Bom, é o seguinte, é que depois de todas essas explanações, de facto, e a intervenção de Charles relativamente à experiência de Timor-Leste, algumas questões que nós temos que olhar com muita cautela, mas acima de tudo com olhar para o futuro, o que é que nós efetivamente precisamos para Moçambique. Porque não podemos pensar que apenas a criação de um hipotético Fundo Soberano vai resolver todos os nossos problemas. Provavelmente até possa criar novos problemas. Então nós temos que ter uma estratégia muito bem montada e até tem que haver de facto um máximo de debate público de modo a que seja de consenso o mais consensual possível, em que possamos decidir efetivamente o que é que nós pretendemos com Moçambique. Porque, de facto, podemos até precisar de um fundo soberano, mas enquanto a questão se pode colocar, quer dizer, nós estamos a correr para um fundo soberano enquanto ainda não temos um orçamento soberano. Quer dizer, e ter um orçamento soberano significa que os problemas de hoje eventualmente estarem minimizados. Então começamos a pensar nos problemas de amanhã. Quer dizer, como é que se diz, este problema entre resolver problemas de hoje e também pensarmos no amanhã, de facto, temos que olhar isto com olhos de ver, como se costuma dizer. Mas não é, de facto, isso não nos deve desfalecer, pelo contrário, isso é um grande desafio para nós, pensarmos ainda mais e irmos buscar aquilo que foram os erros cometidos por outras experiências, outros países, para vermos de que modo é que nós, em Moçambique, não iremos cometer o mesmo tipo de erros. Porque temos que pensar também naquilo que eles têm bem e conseguiram fazer muito bem, para também nós conseguirmos implementar essas boas práticas, experiências de outros países, de modo a que efetivamente consigamos também, em certa medida, corresponder a alguma expectativa da sociedade moçambicana, porque parecendo que não, por mais que a gente não queira, mas a expectativa da sociedade é elevadíssima relativamente àquilo que vai acontecer, principalmente na região de Cabo Delgado. E nós temos que, em certa medida, criar mecanismos que possam ajudar a satisfazer alguma dessa expectativa e criar alguma esperança nos moçambicanos que, efetivamente, de uma forma global, todos nós nos podemos beneficiar dos recursos que o país vai criar e esse benefício tem que naturalmente se materializar na melhoria da qualidade de vida dos moçambicanos. Muito obrigado.
Muitíssimo obrigado, Sr. Presidente, Dr. Boene, por essas considerações. I have few questions. Dr. Charles, you have said, and people are asking, how to prevent the money from the future sovereign fund from being stolen. This is one. Two, how to engage civil society. How can civil society participate meaningfully in the establishment of the fund and also in the governance of the fund as a mechanism, as an external mechanism of checks and balances? How to ensure that, because you have said, and we have taken note, that politicians, they can, and they tend to easily change the rules of the game. So how to empower civil society to meaningfully participate and to meaningfully check the attempts by politicians to go that direction. And the issue of transparency. How to ensure transparency? They are the Santiago principles. How the Timor-Leste experience is tapping into the Santiago principles for the wealth. How good is Timor doing compared to the Santiago principles? These, in summary, are the key questions from the chat box. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you. In terms of how to prevent the money from being stolen, I don't know. I mean, I think transparency does that. At least with transparency, then you know if it's been stolen. And if you have monthly reports that are published, as Timor-Leste's central bank publishes monthly reports on what the balance is, on how it's invested, you'll see pretty quickly if it's not what it should be. One of the things that we do, my civil society organization does, is we compare the reports from the oil companies, the reports from the Petroleum Regulatory Agency, the INPM, and the results from the reports from the central bank, and see that the numbers match up. If the numbers don't match up, then we ask privately first, whichever number is off. I mean, just yesterday I wrote an email to the head of the National Petroleum Authority saying, why don't your reports show that there was profit oil received in the last few months? Because the central bank reports show that that money was deposited into the fund. How come it's not in the ANPM reports? And I haven't gotten an answer yet, but hopefully it will. But I think that's the way civil society gets engaged. And it's maybe easier in Timor-Leste because we're such a small country that many of the people in NGOs are on friendly social basis or family connections with the people who are managing the fund or the people in government or the people in the Ministry of Finance. And they all, or almost all of them, came out of civil society because there was no government before 2002. So the leaders of the country were in civil society, and they haven't, not all of them anyway, have forgotten that. And so there's a good relationship there, and we can send emails and we can ask for meetings, and we almost always get them. I don't know if that's true in Mozambique. In terms of the Santiago principles, to be honest, the Timor-Leste created its sovereign wealth fund before the Santiago principles were written, and so it wasn't really a relevant factor in our design of the fund. And I haven't looked lately about how it measures, how it compares with that. But I think transparency is only useful if people in civil society, in opposition political parties, in the media, read the information, understand the information, and respond to the information. The government can produce huge reports filled with numbers, as they do in Timor-Leste, and if nobody looks at them, it doesn't have any value. I mean, for example, the Timor-Leste government just published, and this is a very positive step, and it's the first time they've done it, they published the general state accounts, the Conta Geral do Estado, for last year. You know, they put it on the Ministry of Finance website. The summary table in that report, the report's more than 1,000 pages, the numbers don't add up. I don't know if anybody's checked it or why or what. I haven't actually engaged with the Ministry of Finance to ask them why the numbers don't add up. The total at the bottom of the table is different than the sum of all the numbers that are in the table. But the fact that it hasn't been corrected, to me, indicates that not a lot of people are reading these documents and engaging them, including the institutions that prepare them. And so I think that's very important for civil society organizations in Mozambique to do that and to develop the expertise and to have the time to really go through those reports. And if the reports are not there, to demand that they be issued. But the reports themselves are required by law. In a few cases, government agencies do better than the law requires, but in most cases, they only do the minimum of what the law requires. So it's very important to have the legal requirement there. Thank you.
I recall in the past webinar, we were discussing the Nigerian experience, and the people kept asking is how to prevent corruption, how to make sure that the money will not just go missing. As you have clearly said, for politicians, it's about cycles. It's for the next cycle. They don't think long term. They don't think developmental. They think about winning elections and about maintaining their power and their clientelistic systems. So how to go about that? And also to make sure that sovereign wealth funds are not used to further give the political and economic instruments for domination by one part dominant party systems that are ruling most of the African countries. This was an attempt, as we have initially said, at empowering civil society to participate in this process, to meaningfully participate. And the larger context of these webinars is on the wealth sovereign fund as not only an instrument to stabilize the economy, but also the possibility to catalyze good governance and fiscal transparency. This is our particular take. We know that the central bank here in Mozambique is progressing towards the delivering the first draft of the technical proposal, of which civil society was not given opportunity for input. Civil society was not given any space to input in that discussion led by the central bank here in Mozambique. Most central banks, they look at themselves as highly technical, inaccessible to ordinary citizens and to civil society, but we highly criticize that. We don't agree with that particular way of getting things done. And these words are directed directly to the governor of central bank here in Maputo, Dr. Zandamela. We don't agree with that approach. We think that although the central bank is highly technical, we recognize that, but it needs to open up the space for civil society to meaningfully participate. Because a sovereign wealth fund is a policy option. Not all countries with this kind of resources, they have gone that option. So being a policy option, it means that civil society and the wider public have to have an opportunity to participate. So we highly recommend Dr. Zandamela to allow civil society to meaningfully participate. While we criticize that, we commend the parliament. We commend the parliament for meaningfully participating with us in this series of webinars as a part of learning process. We also commend the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy for continuously engaging and participating with us. And we also commend the Tax Authority for once again and since the beginning to allowing civil society participation in its process, and also allowing itself to participate in civil society initiatives. This is how governance is strengthened. This is how governance is set right. To Oxfam, our partners from in the beginning of these discussions, we thank you so much for being with us. We count on you. We count on you, and we hope we can continue the engagements. The next webinar is next Thursday at the very same time, and we will have the colleague from Botswana sharing the Tswana experience on how they established their sovereign fund and how they govern it to avoid resource cuts. Thank you very much to our participants. Thank you very much to all of you, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. To my good friend Charles, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charles. And my warm greetings to the colleagues from Lao Hamutuk in East Timor. Thank you so much. We are together. Thank you.